The sky above Earth had not known war for over 100 years, and Commander Sira Okonkwo liked it that way. She stood at the observation deck of the orbital defense platform called Canopy Watch, her dark eyes scanning the quiet blue curve of the planet below. Her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee she had forgotten to drink an hour ago. Earth was peaceful now, a world that had clawed itself back from the edge of ruin centuries ago, and the proof of that miracle stretched across the surface beneath her, the Great Verdance, a continent-spanning forest that covered restored Amazonia, Central Africa, and Southeast Asia, all linked by orbital climate bridges that kept the rain falling and the air clean. It was the largest living ecosystem in known space, and every human colony scattered across the stars considered it sacred. Sira had grown up hearing stories about it, about how humanity had nearly killed their own world with pollution and greed and fire, and how they had spent 200 years healing what they had broken, planting tree after tree after tree, until the green came back stronger than before. She had walked through it once as a child, holding her mother's hand beneath trees so tall they seemed to hold up the sky, and she had promised herself she would protect it forever. Tonight was supposed to be a quiet rotation, nothing but routine scans and the distant hum of satellites tracking trade convoys moving through the outer system. But something was wrong. Her tactical officer, a young man named Dara, looked up from his console with a face that had gone pale, and he said 3 words that changed everything: unknown fleet inbound. Sira crossed the deck in 4 strides and looked at his screen, and her blood went cold. A massive formation of ships had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the lunar perimeter, far too close to Earth, far past every early warning station and every defense line humanity had built in the outer colonies. They had come disguised as a migrating trade convoy, their signatures masked behind forged transponder codes, and now they were shedding their disguise like a snake shedding its skin, revealing hulls of dark chitin and sharp angles that Sira recognized from intelligence briefings she had hoped would never matter. The Velthari Dominion, an ancient insectoid hegemony that had conquered over 800 species across the galaxy, an empire built on a simple and terrible method. They would arrive at a world, burn its biosphere to ash, and terraform the remains into breeding grounds for their ever-expanding hive. No species had ever successfully fought back against them, and every galactic power treated them the way small animals treat a predator, with silence and distance and prayer. And now they were here, above Earth, and Sira had maybe 5 minutes before they were in weapons range. She slammed her hand on the emergency channel and screamed for every ship in the system to scramble, but she already knew it was too late, because the Velthari fleet was not heading for the cities or the military stations or the orbital platforms. They were positioning themselves above the Great Verdance. The first Cinder Lance fired at exactly 14:07 Terran Standard Time. It was an orbital thermal weapon, a beam of concentrated heat that cut through the atmosphere like a blade of white fire and struck the forest below with the fury of a dying star. The trees did not burn, they exploded, moisture inside ancient trunks superheating in an instant, sending shockwaves across the canopy that flattened everything for kilometers in every direction. Then the second lance fired, and the third and the fourth, and within minutes the sky below Canopy Watch was nothing but light. Sira stood at the observation window and watched the world burn. She could see the firestorm spreading across continents, a wall of flame so vast it created its own weather, pulling in oxygen from the surrounding atmosphere and feeding itself like a living thing. The heat was so intense that rivers boiled and lakes turned to steam, and animals that had taken centuries to bring back from extinction died in seconds, their bodies turning to carbon before they could even run. 17 minutes, that was all it took. In 17 minutes, 4.5 billion acres of forest were reduced to ash, and the smoke rose so high and so thick that it was visible from Mars, a dark bruise spreading across the face of the blue planet like a wound that would never heal. Sira could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. She just stood there with tears running down her face while alarms screamed around her, and her crew shouted for orders she could not give. Because what do you say when someone burns down the thing you loved most in the universe? The Velthari broadcast their message on every frequency, in every human language, with the cold efficiency of a species that had done this 800 times before. Your cradle is ash, submit, or your colonies follow. The message reached every human world within hours, carried by faster-than-light communication, relays that Sira herself had helped maintain, and billions of people heard it and looked up at the sky and felt something crack inside their chests. Earth's defense grid was crippled, half its platforms destroyed in the initial assault, and the Velthari fleet sat in orbit like a crown of thorns around the wounded planet, waiting for the surrender they had always received before. The galactic community responded the way it always did, with words. Condolences arrived from 100 species, carefully worded statements of sympathy that said everything except the one thing that mattered, which was, "We will help you fight." No one helped, because no one had ever beaten the Velthari, and the galaxy had long ago decided that the smart thing to do was to stay quiet and hope the swarm moved in a different direction. Sira finally left the observation deck 12 hours after the burning, her eyes red and her hands still shaking, and she walked through corridors filled with crew members who looked at her with faces that held nothing but grief and rage in equal measure. She found herself in the briefing room where Admiral Konstantin Voss was about to address the UN War Council via emergency holographic link. Voss was old, a man who had spent his entire career commanding ships that never fired their weapons, a peacetime admiral who had always believed that humanity's greatest achievement was learning to solve problems without violence. He stood at the podium with ash on his uniform, actual ash, carried up from the surface by a shuttle that had tried and failed to rescue survivors from the Verdants, and his hands were steady even though his eyes were not. The War Council stared at him through their holographic displays, representatives from every human world, their faces drawn and gray, and the silence in that chamber was the heaviest thing Sira had ever felt. Voss looked at them for a long time before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, like a man talking to his children before a storm. "They think fire is the end of a forest," he said, and he paused, and something moved behind his old eyes that was not grief anymore but something harder, something that had roots going down deep into the bedrock of what it meant to be human. "They don't understand. Fire is how some forests begin." No one in the chamber said a word, but Sira saw it happen in real time. The shift, the moment when grief stopped being an anchor and became a fuel, and she watched the faces of admirals and generals and politicians harden into something the Velthari had never encountered in 800 conquests. Not surrender, not despair, not even rage. Purpose. And somewhere far below, in the ash and ruin of what had once been the most beautiful place in the galaxy, beneath the blackened soil where nothing should have been able to survive, something stirred in the darkness. A seed buried deep, waiting for the fire to pass. Waiting to grow. The galaxy expected humanity to scream. Every species that had ever faced the Velthari followed the same pattern. First came the shock, then the grief, then the desperate pleas for mercy broadcast on every open channel, and finally the surrender, quiet and total, the sound of a civilization folding in on itself like a dying star. Humanity did none of these things. Humanity went silent. The communication relays between human worlds still functioned, but no messages leaked outward, no diplomatic channels opened, no ambassadors appeared before the Galactic Council to beg for intervention or negotiate terms. For 2 weeks after the burning of the Great Verdants, The rest of the galaxy heard nothing from human space, and that silence was more terrifying than any war cry could have been. The Velthari overmined. A collective intelligence that had guided the Dominion for 10,000 years, processed this silence with what its vast neural network could only categorize as confusion. Every model it ran predicted surrender within days, because that was what always happened, because fire always won, because no species had ever looked at the ashes of everything they loved and chosen to stand back up. The Overmind did not understand humanity, and this would prove to be the most expensive mistake in the history of the galaxy. On Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, buried 3 kilometers beneath the frozen surface inside a facility that did not officially exist, Dr. Lena Vasquez stepped off a military transport and into a world she had never imagined. She was a xenobiologist, a woman who had spent her career studying alien ecosystems on colony worlds, cataloging how life adapted and evolved in environments that were nothing like Earth. And she had been pulled from her research vessel, the Sequoia, with orders that said only, "Report to Titan, priority absolute." The facility was enormous, carved out of the ice and rock by mining drones that had been reprogrammed in secret months before the Velthari attack, and it was filled with the brightest minds humanity had to offer: geneticists, ecologists, mycologists, atmospheric chemists, and weapons engineers, all working side by side in a space that hummed with urgency and purpose. A tall woman with silver hair and steady hands met Lena at the entrance and introduced herself as Director Aisha Cowrie, and she led Lena through corridor after corridor of laboratories and growing chambers and sealed biovaults before finally stopping in front of a massive blast door. "What you are about to see is called Project Ember," Aisha said, her voice calm and measured in a way that made Lena's stomach tighten, "and it is going to win us this war." The door opened, and Lena walked into a chamber the size of a cathedral, and she stopped breathing. Inside were rows upon rows of biological specimens, engineered organisms, modified plants, weaponized fungal cultures, and things that Lena could not immediately identify, but that made the scientist in her want to weep with awe and the human in her want to weep with something else entirely. Aisha explained it all with the patience of a teacher and the precision of a surgeon. Humanity, she said, was the only known species in the galaxy that had nearly destroyed its own biosphere and then rebuilt it from nothing. No other civilization had ever done this, because no other civilization had ever been foolish enough or stubborn enough or desperate enough to push their own world to the edge of death and then spend 200 years pulling it back. This meant that humans understood ecosystems in a way that no one else could, not just how they worked, but how they broke, how they collapsed, how they could be dismantled piece by piece or shattered all at once, and most importantly, how they could be rebuilt from ash and ruin and almost nothing at all. Project Ember was the weaponization of that knowledge. Everything in this chamber was designed to attack the Velthari at the level of their biology, their ecology, the very foundation of their civilization, and Lena understood immediately why they had called her here, because she had spent 15 years studying alien biomes, and she knew exactly how fragile even the mightiest ecosystems could be when you understood their weak points. Across human space, the mobilization was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. It was not just a military effort. It was everything. Every hand and every mind and every beating heart turned toward a single purpose. Forge worlds that had been built to construct colony ships melted down their production lines and began producing warships at a pace that made the automated systems overheat, and engineers worked in shifts that lasted until they collapsed, sleeping on the factory floors for a few hours before getting up and starting again. Agricultural stations that had fed a dozen colony worlds redesigned their output entirely, growing biological payloads that would be loaded into missiles and dropped on Velthari worlds like seeds of destruction. Artists painted murals on the hulls of warships, images of the great verdants, of trees and rivers and animals that no longer existed, so that every vessel that flew into battle carried the memory of what had been lost. Teachers released their students early so that the older ones could join the effort, and the younger ones could be moved to safety on the deep colonies. And parents held their children and whispered promises that they would make this right. It was not rage that drove them, though rage was certainly there, burning hot and bright in every human chest. It was something deeper, something that came from the same place inside them that had once looked at a dying planet and said, "No, we will fix this." The same stubborn refusal to accept that destruction was the end of the story. On the military side, Captain Reese Tanaka received his orders in a briefing room on Mars that smelled of recycled air and stale coffee. Reese was a Marine, 34 years old, with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw and eyes that had gone flat and cold on the day the verdants burned, because his wife and daughter had been hiking in the Central African section of the forest when the cinder lances fell, and there had been no time to run and no shelter deep enough to matter. He had not cried, not once, and the people around him found this more frightening than if he had screamed for days. His assignment was to lead a new special operations unit designated as the Ash Walkers, soldiers selected for their ability to operate on scorched and biologically hostile worlds, trained to survive in environments where everything was dead and the air itself was poison. The Ash Walkers would be the ones who went in first, who walked through the ruins and the wreckage and planted the seeds of something new. And Reese accepted the command with a nod that carried the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to avenge. Meanwhile, Intelligence Officer Miriam St. Clair, working from a classified station orbiting Neptune, made the discovery that would change the course of the war. The Velthari, for all their power, had a weakness, a single critical vulnerability that they had kept hidden for millennia behind layers of military might, and the simple fact that no conquered species had ever survived long enough to find it. Their entire civilization depended on something called the Velspore Lattice, a bioengineered fungal network that connected the hive minds of every Velthari world, allowing the Overmind to coordinate billions of individual drones across thousands of light years in real time. Without the lattice, the Velthari were not an empire. They were just insects, billions of confused and directionless creatures stumbling around in the dark, unable to communicate, unable to coordinate, unable to fight as a unified force. And fungi, Miriam knew with a smile that did not reach her eyes, were something that humans understood very, very well. She transmitted her findings to Titan, to Director Cowery, to Project Ember, and within hours the entire focus of the project shifted toward a single goal, creating something that could eat the lattice alive. Back on Earth, in the blackened wasteland that had once been the most beautiful place in the galaxy, something was happening that the Velthari satellites could not detect. Beneath the ash, beneath the scorched and ruined soil, human teams in sealed environment suits were working in silence, planting billions of engineered seeds in precise patterns across the dead ground. The seeds were special, designed by the same minds that had rebuilt Earth's biosphere centuries ago, modified to grow at 100 times the natural rate, encoded with genetic instructions that would make them into something the galaxy had never seen before. They lay dormant in the dark Earth, waiting for the signal, waiting for water and light, and the moment when humanity would need them most. And above it all, in orbit around a wounded world, the Velthari fleet sat and waited for the surrender that would never come, utterly unaware that the silence they heard was not the sound of a species dying. It was the sound of a species putting down roots. 6 months after the burning, the Velthari Overmind received a transmission from its forward staging world of Charvek, a planet that had been stripped of its native life and converted into a military hub 3 centuries ago. The transmission was 4 words long: "The sky is green." The Overmind did not understand what this meant, and by the time it did, Charvek was already lost. Commander Sira Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the warship Ironbark, flagship of the newly built Terran Second Fleet, and watched through the tactical display as her plan unfolded with the precision of a surgeon's knife. Operation Backdraft had begun. The fleet had jumped into the Charvek system 20 minutes ago, 140 warships emerging from faster-than-light travel, in a formation that the Velthari defense grid immediately recognized as an attack pattern, and the alien garrison had scrambled to respond with the mechanical efficiency of a hive mind that had won 10,000 battles. But Sira's fleet was not here to fight the garrison, not directly, not yet. Instead, her ships fired a single coordinated volley that the Velthari initially mistook for conventional warheads, tracking the projectiles on their sensors and calculating intercept solutions with the speed of 1 trillion networked minds. They did not intercept them, because the projectiles were not aimed at the garrison or the fleet or any military target at all. They were aimed at the atmosphere. The warheads burst open at high altitude, and from each one poured a cloud of engineered spores, billions upon billions of microscopic organisms designed by Dr. Lena Vasquez and the Project Ember team on Titan, coded with genetic instructions that turned them into the most aggressive colonizers in the history of biology. They were pyrophytic spore bombs, and they did something that no weapon in the galaxy had ever done before. They grew. The spores drifted down through Charvek's atmosphere and settled on the planet's surface, on the Velthari terraforming substrate, the engineered biological material that the aliens used to convert conquered worlds into hive-compatible environments, and they began to feed. Within hours, green shoots were pushing through the alien substrate, cracking it open the way tree roots crack concrete, and the Velthari ground forces watched in something that their hive mind could only process as bewilderment as their carefully engineered world began to come apart beneath their feet. The spores consumed the substrate and replaced it with aggressive earth vegetation, fast-growing grasses, then shrubs, then saplings that shot up at rates that should have been biologically impossible, their engineered genes burning through growth cycles in days that would normally take years. The planet's infrastructure began to rot from the ground up, support structures weakened by roots that grew into every crack and seam, atmospheric processors choked by pollen and airborne seeds, communication arrays brought down by vines that climbed with a speed and purpose that felt almost intentional. Because it was intentional, every organism in that payload had been designed with the Velthari's specific biology in mind, engineered to target their materials, their structures, their world, and to replace it all with something green and alive and utterly hostile to the hive. Sira watched the planet's surface change color on her tactical display, gray and brown giving way to green, and she allowed herself a small, hard smile before turning her attention to the garrison fleet, which was now disorganized and confused and fighting a battle on two fronts, one against the human fleet above and one against the living world below. It was a rout. Across the galaxy, on a dozen different worlds, similar scenes were playing out as humanity launched coordinated strikes against Velthari positions, each one tailored to the specific conditions of the target world, each one using biological weapons that turned the Velthari's own conquered territory against them. The galactic community watched in stunned disbelief, because this was not how wars were supposed to work. Species were supposed to throw metal and energy at each other until one side broke, not turn planets into weapons, not fight with seeds and spores and the raw, unstoppable force of life itself. But humanity had never fought the way other species expected them to, and that was proving to be a very serious problem for the Velthari. On the other side of the war, Captain Reese Tanaka dropped through the atmosphere of Nexum Prime in a landing pod that shook so violently he could feel his teeth rattling in his skull. Nexum Prime was the heart of the Velthari Dominion, the oldest hive world, the place where the Overmind had first awakened 10,000 years ago, and from which the Velspor lattice spread outward to every corner of their empire like a web of living nerve tissue. Getting here had cost the lives of 6,000 Marines across 3 staging operations, and Reese carried every single one of those deaths in his chest like stones in a bag, heavy and sharp, and impossible to put down. His unit, 12 Ash Walkers, the best of the best, soldiers who had trained for months in scorched hellscapes to prepare for exactly this mission, hit the ground running, emerging from their pods into an alien landscape that looked like the inside of a living body. The surface of Nexum Prime was not rock or soil, but a vast organic structure, a world-spanning organism of chitin and fungal tissue, and poolsing biological conduits that carried nutrients and information to every corner of the planet. And walking on it felt like walking on the skin of something enormous and very much alive. The air was thick with spores that would have killed an unprotected human in minutes, and the Ash Walkers moved through it in sealed combat suits that filtered every breath and monitored every heartbeat, their weapons loaded with specialized ammunition designed to burn through Velthari biological armor. They fought their way into the hive tunnels, vast corridors of ribbed chitin that descended into the planet's interior like the throat of some impossibly large creature, and the resistance they met was fierce and relentless. Velthari warrior drones came at them in waves, each one the size of a large dog, with mandibles that could cut through steel and compound eyes that tracked movement with inhuman precision. And Reese killed them with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had stopped being afraid of death on the day he lost his family. They pushed deeper, losing soldiers with every chamber they cleared, and in the narrow spaces between firefights Reese heard his team performing the ritual they had adopted in training, whispering the names of trees that no longer existed on Earth. Oak, they whispered as they reloaded their weapons in a chamber slick with alien fluids, Sequoia. They murmured as they sealed the wounds of fallen comrades, Banyan. They breathed as they stepped over the bodies of the dead and kept moving forward. It was their way of remembering what they were fighting for, a prayer spoken in the language of things that grew. They lost 4 more before they reached the central nexus, a vast underground cathedral where the Velspor lattice converged into a single massive node, a poolsing tower of fungal tissue that rose from the floor to the ceiling, glowing with a sickly bioluminescence, humming with the thoughts of 1,000,000,000,000 connected minds. Reese looked at it and felt nothing but cold determination. The mission had always been simple: reach the central node, deploy the Thornwall payload, and get out. The Thornwall was Dr. Vasquez's masterpiece, the crown jewel of Project Ember, a genetically engineered mycological predator, a fungus designed to eat the Velthari's fungus, coded to spread through the lattice's own communication pathways and consume it from the inside out. It was, in essence, a disease for a civilization, and it would travel through every connection the lattice had ever made, reaching every hive world, every outpost, every node, eating as it went until there was nothing left to connect. Reese opened the deployment case and armed the payload, and he looked at his remaining team, 7 soldiers, all of them wounded, all of them exhausted, all of them watching him with eyes that held no fear because they had already made peace with what this mission might cost. "For the Verdants," he said, and they echoed him in voices that were steady and sure. He deployed the Thornwall, and the device opened like a flower, releasing a cloud of engineered spores that settled on the central node and began to feed. The reaction was immediate. The node pulsed, flickered, and the hum that filled the chamber changed pitch, rising into something that sounded almost like a scream transmitted through a medium that was not quite sound and not quite thought. The lattice was fighting back, trying to reject the invader, but the Thornwall had been designed by people who understood fungi better than any species in the galaxy, and it adapted faster than the lattice could respond, finding new pathways, new vulnerabilities, new ways to consume. Move, Reese barked, and the ash walkers ran. Behind them, the cathedral was beginning to shake, the walls cracking as the lattice convulsed. And the sound that followed them through the tunnels was the sound of an empire beginning to die from the inside out. Above Nexum Prime, above Charvek, above a dozen burning worlds, the Velthari Overmind felt something it had no word for, something that lived in the space between certainty and collapse, between dominance and doubt. 10,000 years of unbroken conquest, 800 species brought to their knees, and now, for the first time, the Overmind looked at the enemy it faced and could not predict what would happen next. The closest translation for what it felt was dread. And on world after world, in the places where humanity's spores had taken root, the forests were growing, green and wild and relentless, swallowing the works of the Velthari like the tide swallowing footprints in the sand. The galaxy had never seen anything like it, and the Velthari had never faced anything like it. And somewhere in the chaos, a simple truth was becoming clear to every species watching from the sidelines. Humanity did not just fight wars. They planted them. The Velthari came back for Earth with everything they had. The Overmind had felt the thorn wall spreading through the edges of the lattice like frost creeping across a window, and it understood with a cold and ancient clarity that if it did not end this war now, if it did not crush the species that had dared to strike at the heart of the Dominion, then the Dominion itself would not survive. So it gathered every warship from every sector, pulling its fleets back from conquered worlds and staging areas and defensive positions across 1,000 star systems, and it sent them all, every last one, to the place where this had started. Earth. Admiral Konstantin Voss stood on the command deck of the rebuilt Canopy Watch and watched the Velthari armada drop out of faster-than-light travel like a wall of darkness spreading across the stars. There were more than 3,000 warships, each one a fortress of living chitin and bioplasma weapons, and they filled the space between Earth and the Moon with a mass so dense that it blocked the sunlight and cast a shadow across the Pacific Ocean below. It was the largest fleet ever assembled in the recorded history of the galaxy, and it had come to kill a world. Voss was 71 years old, and his bones ached in the cold of the station, and his hands trembled slightly in a way that he had learned to hide from his crew. But his mind was sharp, and his voice was steady, and he had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment. "All ships," he said into the fleet-wide channel, his words reaching every human vessel in the system, 400 warships, a fraction of what the Velthari had brought, crewed by men and women who had kissed their families goodbye and flown to Earth knowing they might not fly home. This is where we hold. The Battle of Earth began at dawn, and it was the most violent thing the galaxy had ever witnessed. Human ships crashed into the Velthari formation like a fist into a swarm, and the space around Earth became a hell of plasma fire, and detonating hulls and spinning debris that burned as it fell through the atmosphere like artificial meteors. The Velthari fought with the precision of a hive mind, each ship moving in perfect coordination with every other, their attacks synchronized to the microsecond, their formations shifting and adapting like a living organism, responding to a threat. But humanity fought with something the hive mind could not replicate: individual creativity, the ability of each captain and each pilot and each gunner to make decisions that no algorithm could predict, to take risks that no rational calculation would support, to do the unexpected and the impossible because sometimes that was the only thing left to do. Commander Sira Okonkwo, leading a battle group from the bridge of the Ironbark, drove her ships directly into the heart of the Velthari formation, in a maneuver so reckless that her own tactical officer shouted a warning that she ignored, and she split the enemy fleet in two, creating a gap that 3 other battle groups poured through like water through a broken dam. Ships died on both sides in numbers that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. human vessels breaking apart under the weight of concentrated fire, Velthari dreadnoughts cracking open as human weapons found the seams in their living armor, and the debris field grew so thick that navigation became as dangerous as the enemy. Voss took a piece of shrapnel in his side when a secondary explosion ripped through Canopy Watch's command deck, and he pressed his hand against the wound and stayed on his feet and kept giving orders because the battle was not over, and he would not sit down until it was. And then below them, something happened that changed everything. On the surface of Earth, in the vast blackened wasteland where the great verdants had once stood, the ground began to move. It started as a tremor, a vibration that seismographs picked up across the planet, and then the ash began to crack and split apart as something pushed up from below, something green and alive and impossibly fast. Trees erupted from the scorched earth like explosions in reverse, trunks shooting upward at speeds that defied every known law of biology, their engineered genes firing on all cylinders, fueled by months of stored energy, and activated by a signal sent from a facility on Titan that Dr. Lena Vasquez had been waiting 6 months to transmit. The new forest grew in real time, visible from orbit, a wave of green spreading across the continents like a tide of life sweeping over a landscape of death, and the trees did not stop at the height of normal trees. They kept going, soaring hundreds of meters into the sky, their trunks as wide as buildings, their canopies so vast that they created their own wind patterns. And they were not just trees. Woven into their DNA, encoded alongside the instructions for growth and photosynthesis and reproduction, were specifications for something else entirely: biointegrated defense systems, grown from living wood and powered by the same biological processes that turned sunlight into sugar, capable of channeling that energy into something far more destructive. The forest opened fire. Beams of concentrated bioenergy lanced upward from the canopy, each one powered by a tree the size of a skyscraper, each one carrying enough force to crack the hull of a Velthari warship, and the alien fleet that had come to destroy Earth found itself under attack from the planet itself. The Velthari had burned a forest and thought the story was over, and now that forest had grown back with teeth. On all Velthari frequencies, a human voice began to speak, calm and clear and carrying the weight of a story that had been waiting to be told. Miriam St. Clair sat in a broadcast station on the moon and spoke not to humanity but to the Velthari, and she did not threaten them or demand their surrender. She told them a story. She told them about a species that had been born on a small blue world at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy, a species that had been gifted with a paradise of forests and oceans and mountains, and had repaid that gift with fire and poison and greed. She told them how humanity had cut down their own forests, how they had driven their own animals to extinction, how they had pumped toxins into their own air and water until the world they lived on began to die around them. She told them that humanity understood destruction better than any species in the galaxy, not because they had conquered others, but because they had practiced on themselves first. And then she told them the part that mattered. She told them how humanity had looked at the ruin they had created and made a choice. Not to accept it, not to move on, not to find a new world and start over, but to stay and fix what they had broken, tree by tree, river by river, species by species, year by year, for 200 years, until the green came back. "You cannot beat us," Miriam said, her voice reaching every Velthari drone and every world in the Overmind itself, "because we have already beaten the worst enemy we will ever face, and that enemy was ourselves, and we are still here, and we are still growing." Deep inside Nexum Prime, Captain Reese Tanaka was dying. The Thornwall was spreading through the lattice, eating it from the inside, but the central node was fighting back harder than anyone had predicted, rerouting around the damage, finding new pathways, refusing to fall, and Reese knew that the only way to ensure the payload reached critical mass was to deploy a second charge directly into the node's core. The problem was that the spore concentration at the core was lethal, not eventually lethal, not slowly lethal, but the kind of lethal where your lungs dissolved and your blood turned to sludge in your veins within minutes, and no suit could filter it out at that density. Reese looked at his remaining team, 5 soldiers who had followed him through hell, and he saw in their eyes that they knew what he was about to do, and he saw that some of them were ready to volunteer to do it instead. He shook his head. "Get out," he told them, and his voice was soft in a way it had not been since the day his wife died. "Get back to the surface and get off this world, and when you get home, plant something." He took the second payload from its case and walked toward the core. The last thing the Ash Walkers saw before they turned and ran was their captain standing in a cathedral of dying alien light, surrounded by spores that were already eating through his suit, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small sealed container. Inside was a single seed, an earth oak, carried across light years and through nightmare corridors, and into the heart of an alien empire by a man who had lost everything except the belief that things could grow back. He pushed the seed into the alien soil of the chamber floor, and he deployed the thorn wall, and the node screamed. The lattice collapsed. Across 1,000 worlds, the effect was instantaneous. The Overmind's voice cut out like a candle blown out by a hurricane, and 10 billion Velthari drones stumbled and fell and wandered in circles, their connection to each other severed, their sense of purpose and identity and self dissolving into static and silence. The armada above Earth lost coordination in an instant, ships that had moved with the precision of a single mind suddenly drifting and colliding and firing at nothing. Their pilots confused and alone for the first time in their lives, and the human fleet fell on them with a ferocity that was not cruelty, but something far older and far deeper. It was the fury of a species that had been given a second chance and had no intention of wasting it. Admiral Voss, bleeding from his wound and leaning on his command console for support, watched through the observation window as the last Velthari dreadnought broke apart over the Pacific, its chitin hull splitting open and spilling bioluminescent fluid that fell toward the ocean like alien rain. Below, the new forest covered the continents in green, its canopy glowing faintly in the fatting light of battle, and Voss looked at it and felt the tears come at last, not for the victory, but for the man on Nexum Prime who would never see what he had helped to save. "Log it," Voss said to his crew, his voice barely above a whisper. "The forest stands." And it did. 5 years had passed since the war ended, and the galaxy was still learning how to breathe again. The Velthari Dominion, the empire that had terrorized 1,000 star systems for 10,000 years, was gone, not conquered but dissolved, its world scattered, and its people adrift like leaves torn from a branch by a storm they had not seen coming. Without the lattice, without the Overmind's guiding voice filling their minds with purpose and direction, the Velthari had fractured into isolated hive clusters, small groups of a few million each, still alive but no longer connected, no longer dangerous, no longer the nightmare that had kept the galaxy awake for centuries. Some of them had descended into confusion and chaos, their drones wandering the tunnels of their hive worlds without direction, slowly declining as their infrastructure crumbled around them. Others, the ones who had somehow retained enough individual awareness to understand what had happened, had done something that no one expected. They asked for help. The first request came from a small hive cluster on a world called Vereth 7, a former agricultural colony that had been stripped of its native biosphere centuries ago, and was now slowly dying as the Velthari terraforming substrate broke down without the lattice to maintain it. The message was simple and halting, written in broken galactic standard by minds that had never needed language before. "Our world is dying. We do not know how to make things grow, please." Admiral Sira Okonkwo, she still was not used to the title, still felt like the young commander who had stood at the window of Canopy Watch and watched the world burn, read the message in her office aboard the flagship of the Restoration Flotilla, and sat with it for a long time. The flotilla was her command now, a massive humanitarian fleet that traveled from world to world across the former Velthari territory. And its mission was not military, but something that Sira found far more meaningful. They planted forests. On every world the Velthari had conquered and stripped bare, the flotilla's ecologists and botanists and engineers would assess the damage, design a recovery plan, and begin the long, slow work of bringing life back to dead worlds. They planted trees adapted to alien soils, seeded oceans with engineered algae that would rebuild shattered food chains, released animals bred from genetic archives to fill ecological niches that had been empty for centuries. And on worlds where the native species had survived in small numbers, refugees hiding in caves and mountains and deep oceans, waiting out the Velthari occupation the way seeds wait out a fire, the flotilla helped them reclaim their own land, teaching them the techniques humanity had developed during the 2 centuries it had spent healing Earth. It was the hardest and most rewarding work Sira had ever done. She authorized the mission to Vareth 7 without hesitation, because she understood something that the rest of the galaxy was still struggling to accept. That the Velthari were not evil, not in the way that word was usually meant, but broken, a species that had been shaped by a collective consciousness that valued expansion above all else, and had never developed the capacity to nurture or protect or grow. They had destroyed because it was the only thing they knew how to do, and now that the voice telling them to destroy was gone, they were lost, and Sira believed, had to believe, because the alternative was a bitterness she refused to carry, that lost things could be found again. On Earth, Dr. Lena Vasquez walked through the new verdants on a Tuesday morning in spring, and the world around her was so beautiful that it made her chest ache. The new forest was not like the old one. It could not be, because the old one had taken centuries to grow, and this one had been engineered to rise in months, and the differences were visible in every leaf and branch and trunk. The trees were taller, some of them reaching 500 meters into the sky, their bark infused with the metallic compounds that had powered the biodefense systems during the Battle of Earth, giving them a faint silver sheen that caught the light in ways that made the forest look like it was made of living metal. The canopy was thicker, denser, a cathedral ceiling of green so vast that the forest floor existed in a permanent twilight that was not dark but soft, filtered through a billion leaves that turned the sunlight gold. And woven through the earth vegetation, growing alongside oak and sequoia and banyan and pine, were alien species, plants gifted to humanity by the civilizations they had liberated, seeds and cuttings carried across light years as tokens of gratitude from species that had spent centuries in chains, and were now free because a small, stubborn world had refused to kneel. There were trees from Karashi Prime that had leaves like stained glass, filtering light into patterns of blue and violet that danced on the forest floor like living art. There were flowering vines from the Selthari system that bloomed in response to sound, opening their petals when birds sang and closing them in silence, so that the forest was decorated with bursts of color that followed every song. There were grasses from Varath, a gift from the Velthari themselves, delivered by a delegation that had traveled to Earth and stood in the new verdants with compound eyes that had never seen a living forest, trembling with an emotion their species had no name for. Lena walked among it all, her boots crunching on soil that was rich and dark and alive, and she thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, a scientist pulled from a research vessel and shown a room full of weapons made from living things, and she wondered if that woman would recognize this world. She thought she would, because the seeds of this forest had been planted in that room on Titan, not as weapons but as promises. Promises that destruction was not the end, that ash was not a grave but a beginning, that the worst thing you could do to a human was to burn what they loved, because they would simply love something new into existence in its place. On Nexum Prime, in the ruins of the Lattice Cathedral, a small oak tree grew in alien soil. It was not tall, barely 2 meters, its trunk thin and its leaves sparse, but it was alive, growing in a place where nothing should have been able to survive. Its roots pushed deep into the remnants of the dead lattice, drawing nutrients from the decay of an empire. Beside it was a grave. The marker was simple, a slab of native stone, carried up from the tunnels by soldiers who had loved their captain, with words carved in standard that read only Reese Tanaka, Ash Walker. He planted something. Every year on the anniversary of the battle, the surviving Ashwalkers came back to this place. 5 soldiers who had fought their way out of a dying world and carried their captain's memory across the stars, and they stood beside the grave and the tree and whispered the names of forests. It was their ritual, their prayer, and they would continue it for the rest of their lives, and after them their children would continue it, because some things deserve to be remembered forever. On a stage before the Galactic Council, Miriam St. Clair stood beneath the lights of 1,000 watching species and presented the document that would reshape the galaxy. She called it the Canopy Accords, a treaty that established the protection of all planetary biospheres as inviolable, a law written in the language of every signatory species that said one thing clearly and without ambiguity: no one burns a living world ever again. Any species that violated the Accords would face the collective force of every signatory, and Miriam made it clear, with a smile that was warm but carried steel beneath it, that humanity would be leading that response, because humanity had earned the right to stand at the front of that particular line. The motion passed unanimously. Even the fragmented Velthari remnants signed, their representative pressing a chitin-tipped appendage to the document with a solemnity that surprised the delegates around them, because the Velthari were learning, slowly, painfully, one small step at a time, what it meant to be part of a galaxy instead of a threat to it. And on Earth, in the golden light of a spring afternoon, a child ran through the new verdants. Her name was Ada, and she was 7 years old, and she was Sira Okonkwo's daughter, born 2 years after the war in a hospital that overlooked the growing forest, and she had never known a world without trees. She ran between trunks as wide as houses, laughing as alien flowers opened at the sound of her voice, chasing a butterfly with wings that shifted color like a living prism, a species that had not existed before the war, born from the mingling of Earth genetics and alien gifts, something entirely new. She tripped on a root and fell, and her hands sank into the soil, rich and dark and warm, and she felt something beneath her palms, a vibration, deep and slow and steady, like a heartbeat transmitted through the earth itself. It was the pulse of a living world, a planet breathing and growing and healing, a world that had been burned to nothing and had chosen to grow back stronger and wilder and more beautiful than before. Ada laughed because she was 7 and the world was wonderful, and she did not know the history beneath her fingers, did not know about the fire and the war and the captain who had planted a seed in the heart of an alien world, did not know that the soil she knelt on had once been ash. She only knew that it was warm and that things grew here, and that the forest went on and on and on in every direction, farther than she could see, farther than she could imagine. And somewhere above her, high in the canopy where the branches touched the sky, a bird began to sing. It was a song without words and without meaning, just a small bright voice rising into the golden air of a world that had been given a second chance, and it carried on the wind through the trees, through the leaves, through the light, out across the forest and the continent and the ocean and the world, a single clear note that said nothing and everything at the same time. The forest was alive. Humanity was alive. And high above, in the quiet dark of space where the scars of battle were slowly fading, The stars looked down on a small blue world wrapped in green, and they saw something that had not existed before, a species that had learned the hardest lesson the universe had to teach: that the measure of a civilization is not how much it can destroy, it is how much it can grow back.